Hello, this is a video for the module TMM2051 and we're looking at St. Paul this half term, particularly the Corinthian correspondence, and we're now at week 10 and we're looking at 2 Corinthians. This is our final week, and in keeping with the pattern that we established in relation to 1 Corinthians, we're doing a series of videos. This video is about theological issues in 2 Corinthians. So we've just looked at history and geography and provenance and things like that, and we're looking now at what are some of the theological issues and themes that Paul addresses in 2 Corinthians. And so I'm just going to put the handout on the screen. I need to make an apology at the outset. This is a lovely but very creaky vicarage, and so you may hear the heating creaking in the background. So here we are. We've got theological issues. So let's begin. So we've already noted some of Paul's stated aims in 2 Corinthians, and we finished the last video by looking at those. The letter is a substitution for apostolic presence. It's a way of Paul being present, and Paul does this in 1 Corinthians as well. So in 1 Corinthians 5, with the famous excommunication passage, he says, "Though I am absent from you in body, I am present in spirit." And we need to imagine that his being present in the spirit to the Corinthians is also somehow associated with the reading of his epistle. And he carries that over into 2 Corinthians. He also instructs them in regard to the disciplinary issue. There's been a moment of conflict. There's been a sorrowful letter, which some scholars think might be part of 2 Corinthians. I don't. But there's been a sorrowful letter, a moment of conflict. Paul himself was deeply wounded by the conflict, but he did it anyway. And he's instructing now that the community draw the offender back in and reconcile them. And so this is one of the things that he does in chapter 2. There's the encouragement to continue the collection for the Jerusalem church in chapter 9, and there's a final showdown on paper with the false apostles in Corinth. And we might add some other topical or thematic issues. The sandwiched between the statement that the epistle is a substitution for apostolic presence and the instruction about what to do about the disciplinary issue, interspersed with these materials are a whole series of materials to do with apostolic mission, reconciliation, and how that applies to the Corinthian churches. So Paul seems to take the reconciliation of the offender in chapter 2 and the statements about apostleship in chapter 1 as establishing a kind of leitmotif for the first part of the epistle. And so chapters 3 to 5 and 6 to 7 are all about the apostolic mission of reconciliation and how that applies to the Corinthians themselves. In the midst of all of this, Paul goes beyond anything that he's written in 1 Corinthians, where he talks about apostolicity. He talks about giving up his prerogatives, his privileges. Here in 2 Corinthians, that act of sacrifice is intensified, and apostolicity is characterized by suffering and hardship. And that crops up in chapters 1 to 7, but also in chapter 11. And in fact, it becomes a mark of apostolicity that differentiates him from the claims of the false apostles in chapters 10 to 13. And finally, there's also visions and spiritual experiences in chapter 12. This is a running theme with the Corinthians. Spiritual experiences seem to be an immense preoccupation of theirs, and we can hypothesize that there's some sort of prioritization of the spiritual over the material is at play in their attitude towards marital sexuality in 1 Corinthians 7, idle food in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, and even the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. But also, these concerns seem not to have died down as you move into 2 Corinthians. Paul seems to have to justify his claims to be an apostle not only in terms of the suffering for Christ and the witnessing to Christ, but also in terms of visions and revelations, which Paul seems at one point almost to be terribly embarrassed about, and we'll talk about that later. There's space here to consider briefly who Paul's opponents might have been. So let's have a think about that. So, whether we accept the idea that Paul's movements were more complicated than they are described in Acts and in 1 Corinthians, or whether there was an intermediate visit by Paul which allows us to keep Luke's and 1 Corinthians' timeline, there appears to have been a showdown. And that showdown is something that happened between Paul and the community, or at least some people in the community. Now, who are these people? Who were Paul's opponents? And there are so many potentials. I mean, 1 Corinthians begins with, there are factions among you. Some of you support Paul, some of you support Cephas, some of you support Apollos, some of you support Christ. So there's at least 3 parties and a Christ party which claims to be above it all. That could be that. There could be something of that. There is a reference to letters of recommendation in 2 Corinthians 3 and to apostleship in 2 Corinthians 11. And so it could be that the people came from Jerusalem with letters of recommendation. That might be the case. It's worth as well bearing in mind that although Paul identifies an apostle as somebody who is authorized directly by the resurrected Jesus, and that's important to remember. 1 Corinthians makes it quite clear. So does 1 Corinthians 9. 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians 15. In 1 Corinthians 9, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Haven't I seen Jesus our Lord? And 1 Corinthians 15, his apostleship, I am the least of the apostles, because he's the last in a long line of resurrection witnesses. And so for Paul to be an apostle was to enter into a non-replicable, non-expandable group of people who'd seen the risen Jesus with their eyes rather than with the eyes of their mind. There isn't space to talk here about the nature of the difference between resurrection appearances and visionary appearances, but it is worth saying that if Paul's framework were adopted, that would make a very clear demarcation between visionary experience of the risen Jesus in the spirit and seeing Jesus, or at least believing that you're seeing Jesus, not as a vision, but rather with the eyes of your body. That certainly seems to be at play in Paul, but Luke himself, who describes Paul being commissioned by the 12 alongside Barnabas to go to go on a mission, would seem to indicate that there was a diversity of opinion about what constituted an apostle, the appropriate use of the term apostle. Incidentally, and this is an aside, when Paul in Romans 16 talks about a junior as prominent among the apostles, if by that he means that junior was an apostolic witness to the resurrected Jesus, perhaps because she was one of the 500 or something like that, then that would mark out junior as belonging to really quite an exclusive group of people, a non-replicable, non-expandable group of people within the New Testament, Jesus movement communities. That's just an aside. But here, it's quite possible that Paul's definition of apostle wasn't universal, and that apostle might have been a self-designation by a group within the community who appealed to the authority of the 12 against Paul. And this is something C.K. Barrett suggests. And Barrett is usually very good, and so it's worth really considering that. And it's possible, but it's not certain, that these people might be visitors, similar to the obliquely mentioned people from James in Galatians. In any case, that these people appear not to have advocated circumcision, despite the Corinthian church being a mixed church of Jews and Gentiles. There is no indication that they have either a relationship or no relationship to the people mentioned in Galatians. It's quite possible to imagine that if Galatians is very early and not long after the Jerusalem Council, and 2 Corinthians is several years later, that the question of circumcision might be settled, but the people who opposed Paul, or rather the people who sought to draw Paul's mission to the Gentiles into a pattern of Jewish-Gentile relationships that they themselves approved, that those people may very well still be following him, or travelling from place to place, and we can't rule out that these are the same opponents. We probably shouldn't rule it in either. Perhaps the only thing that is clear is that the group were Jewish. How do we know that? Because Paul asks the rhetorical question, are they Hebrews, in 2 Corinthians 11:22, which indicates, I think, that he believes them to be Hebrews. And so they could be Jewish Christians from a different tradition to Paul, who are rocking up trying to draw his communities into their pattern of Jewish-Gentile relations. Or they could just be an internal faction. My own view is that they're probably an internal faction. Interestingly, Paul in 1 Corinthians is very, very, very clear to differentiate his beef, as it were, with the Corinthians over the factionalism to do with Paul and Apollos and Cephas and Christ, from the question of whether he gets on with Cephas or whether he gets on with Apollos. He differentiates those issues quite carefully, treats Apollos as a fellow worker, but thinks that the factionalism is inappropriate. So I think that he probably doesn't have in view external opponents here. They're an internal faction. Note also that there might be some distinction in Paul's rhetoric between pseudo-apostles, 2 Corinthians 11:13, and super-apostles, 2 Corinthians 11:5. We can't rule this in, we can't rule it out. Clearly, the first pseudo-apostles is simply dismissive. You're not apostles, you're false apostles. And the second, is this the language that the faction uses to describe their leaders? Well, Paul's an apostle, but we've got the hyper apostles. Or might this even be an extension of Paul's own description of himself as the least of the apostles in 1 Corinthians 15? Or might it be Paul's appropriation of a kind of might it be Paul's kind of sarcastic retort? Oh, you've got the super apostles. Either way, we don't know for sure, but the people he designates in this way might be the delegates. The pseudo apostles might be the people sent, and the super apostles might be a somewhat ironic designation for the 12, to whose authority these people who claim to be sent appeal. Of course, it is worth bearing in mind that that people sometimes take it upon themselves to be community leaders of one sort or another, and will appeal to people's authority even when they haven't been suitably authorised by them. We can't assume, even if the pseudo-apostles are the people who've rocked up in the community and the super-apostles are the 12, we can't assume that the 12 are behind any of this. We can't assume that they're not either. So, what's fairly evident from this is that the basis on which Paul is challenged by these people touches on multiple issues. So what's the first? Well, from their point of view, Paul isn't one of the 12, and he bears no commendation from them. And, it's relevant to this discussion that Paul seems to have had to address this question before. So in Galatians 1 and 2, and in 1 Corinthians 9 and 15, you get quite a lot about apostleship. I've already mentioned 1 Corinthians 9 and 1 Corinthians 15. But in Galatians 1 and 2, Paul has to walk a fine line between saying, well, the Jerusalem apostles and I agree on certain issues, but not because I'm in line with them. We're all apostles together. And it's important to see that protestations like that are likely to be responses to claims to the opposite, namely that Paul either isn't an authentic apostle or he's a kind of subordinate apostle. And it's important to see how Paul's claims to suffering and hardship in 2 Corinthians are related to this issue. If, let's think about Philippians chapter 2 and 3, where Paul, lays out the suffering of Jesus Christ and then talks about, I want to know the power of Christ's sufferings, being conformed to the likeness of his death in order that I might attain to the resurrection of the dead. Following Jesus for Paul seems to be being conformed to the likeness of his sufferings. And that seems to be the essence in 2 Corinthians of Paul's understanding of apostleship, that our true leaders are the ones that walk ahead of us on the way to die. And this is terribly, terribly important, because what it means is it gives us, Paul's sense of what the litmus test for a true leader is. A true leader is not vainglorious, self-serving, and stands on ceremony. A true leader is prepared to imitate the sacrifice of Jesus. And so Paul's claims to suffering and hardship are actually claims at some level to the presence of Christ being uniquely present in his ministry. These are all claims to apostleship. And why might Paul be making this claim about the sufferings of Jesus? Well, he might be making this claim because actually the institutional argument of I saw the Lord and was commissioned by him personally is not taken as being terribly persuasive by at least some within the Corinthian congregation. And so Paul is pointing to the likeness between his own ministry and the sacrifice of Christ. It's a kind of second tier authorization of Paul's ministry. That's one way of looking at it. There's also this question of rhetoric. More than once in the Corinthian correspondence, Paul refers to the way in which he avoids standard patterns of boldness and eloquence in favour of demonstrations of the Spirit. The Spirit speaks for me through acts of power. And he mentions this again at the commencement of his discussion of the false apostles. And this might be related to their criticism of him. In 1 Corinthians it was to do with eloquence. In 2 Corinthians it's to do with the content. He doesn't talk about visions and prophecies. He doesn't talk about wonders, miraculous revelations, and so on. And if this is combined with a kind of grievance over Paul's rhetorical style, that he's not much of a speaker, not terribly persuasive, and we must remember that all of the rhetorical manuals that we have from antiquity indicate that there was quite a lot of attention paid to appearance, to posture, to tone, to the capacity to win over, and persuasion was closely linked not just to argument but also to flattery. But there's also his reluctance to be paid, which would be the regular practice for anybody who lived from their oratory. And so some of these issues arise in 1 Corinthians. They're obviously an issue. It may very well be that the same issues of spiritual speech and wisdom, particularly seen through rhetoric and visions, are things that the Corinthians just aren't persuaded about by Paul. Then we've also got spiritual experiences. Paul's appeal to visionary experiences later in the epistle seems to suggest that this is part of the pseudo-apostles' claim to significance, and this locates Paul's opponents much more within the purview of the people he addresses in 1 Corinthians 11 to 14, the people who are obsessed with charismata of speech and knowledge, than it does with outside groups. And so there's a real set of questions here. Of course, this question for consideration, I think, is the key one. Given the content of 2 Corinthians, what does this tell us about how successful 1 Corinthians was? If 1 Corinthians had achieved its aims, would there have been a 2 Corinthians? That's a really good question. Why would Paul keep writing to this community about issues that seem to be the same issue rehashed in multiple ways? Let you think about that. So we're on about 23 minutes. I think we've covered the principal kind of theological issues that I wanted to cover in this session. I'm going to pop you back on full screen and just say we've got one more video to follow, which is a brief survey of the contents of 2 Corinthians, and so I'm going to leave it there.